The morning of June 15th, 1944, 75 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses begin their climb over the mountains of China, engines roaring against the thin air. Their target, the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata, Japan, 1,600 miles away. For the crews strapped inside these massive bombers, this is history. The first American strike on the Japanese homeland since the Doolittle raid more than 2 years ago. But below them, in the fighter bases scattered across northern Kyushu, Japanese pilots are already scrambling, veterans who fought in China, over Burma, across the Pacific, men with dozens of kills to their names, men who believe they understand aerial warfare. They're about to climb into their Zeros, their Ki-43 Oscars, their Ki-45 night fighters, and they're expecting, well, a fight. What they don't yet understand is that the aircraft droning toward them at 30,000 feet has already changed the rules of the war. They're fighting. The B-29 isn't just another bomber. It's a machine that operates in a realm the Japanese cannot reach. And before this night is over, that realization will begin to dawn on Japan's finest pilots, a psychological wound that will never truly heal. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the B-29 became such a terror to Japanese fighter pilots, you need to go back to the summer of 1944, when these aircraft first appeared over Japanese-held territory. The reaction wasn't fear, not at first. It was something closer to curiosity mixed with professional disdain. Japanese aces had been the undisputed masters of the Pacific skies for years. They'd flown against Chinese aircraft over Chungking, tangled with British Spitfires over Burma, duelled with American Wildcats and Warhawks across countless islands. Many of them were veterans with 20, 30, 40 kills. The Zero had earned a reputation as perhaps the finest fighter aircraft in the world in 1941 and 42. Nimble, long-ranged, deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot, these men had faced B-17 flying fortresses before. Sure, the American four-engine bombers were tough, bristling with guns, flying in tight formations. But they could be brought down. With skill, with courage, with enough determination. The B-17s bled. They fell. Japanese pilots had learned their weak points, developed tactics, claimed victories. So when intelligence reports started filtering through about a new American bomber, a bigger B-17, the initial response was almost dismissive. Another lumbering target. Bigger meant slower, easier to hit, more aluminum to fill with cannon shells. The Japanese military mindset, trained in the Bushido tradition, emphasized spirit over material. The right warrior, with the right heart, could overcome any odds. A bomber was just a bomber. But then the photographs came back from reconnaissance flights, and the dismissiveness began to crack. The B-29 wasn't just bigger than a B-17. It was massively bigger. Wingspan of 141 feet, length of 99 feet. Each propeller measured over 16 feet across. The thing looked less like an aircraft and more like a flying apartment building. One Japanese intelligence officer, studying the grainy photographs, reportedly said to his colleagues, "This cannot be real. The Americans have built a propaganda model to frighten us." But it was real, and when the B-29s began appearing over Bangkok in early June 1944, staging from bases in India, the Japanese pilots who encountered them came back with troubling reports. The bomber flew high, higher than the intelligence estimates suggested, higher than comfortable interception altitude for most Japanese fighters. And it flew fast, not fighter fast, but fast enough that a pursuing interceptor, already gasping for air at altitude, would struggle to overtake it. The specifications were sobering. The B-29 could cruise at over 30,000 feet. At that altitude, the air pressure is less than a third of sea level. Your body gets roughly half the oxygen it needs. Japanese fighters, like the Zero, designed for agility and range at medium altitudes, suffered badly up there. The Nakajima Sakae 12 engine that powered the Zero produced 925 horsepower at sea level. But at 30,000 feet, it wheezed, struggled. lost power with every foot of climb. The Zero's published service ceiling was 33,000 feet, but that number was deeply misleading. Service ceiling means the absolute maximum altitude an aircraft can theoretically reach, flying straight and level, with no reserves for maneuvering. In practice, the Zero became sluggish and nearly uncontrollable above 25,000 feet. Pilots reported frozen controls, engines that wouldn't respond to throttle inputs, cockpits coated in frost, and oxygen masks that iced over, making each breath a fight. Meanwhile, the B-29 cruised serenely above them. Not struggling, not gasping. The reason? A technological leap that Japanese engineers had attempted but never successfully implemented in a combat aircraft: full cabin pressurization. Inside the B-29, in 3 separate pressurized compartments, the 11-man crew breathed normally. The cabin maintained pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet, while the aircraft flew at 30,000. No bulky oxygen masks freezing to faces. No electrically heated suits that drained precious energy and still left fingers numb. The pilots sat in shirt sleeves. The bombardier worked his instruments with steady hands. The gunners tracked targets with clear minds. This wasn't just a comfort feature. This was a combat multiplier. A German bomber crew at altitude fought 2 battles, one against the enemy, one against their own bodies. Hypoxia dulled the mind, made calculations harder, slowed reaction times. Crews would make mistakes they'd never make on the ground, not realizing they were impaired until it was too late. British and American bomber crews over Europe dealt with the same problem. Hours at altitude, breathing bottled oxygen, fighting the cold, arriving over the target already half exhausted. The B-29 crews arrived fresh, alert, fully capable, and that made all the difference. But the psychological impact went deeper than just crew comfort. For Japanese pilots, the B-29 represented something profoundly demoralizing, an enemy who fought from a place they couldn't reach. Imagine being a swordsman, trained all your life in blade work, suddenly facing an opponent with a rifle. Your skills still matter, your courage is still real, but you cannot close the distance, you cannot bring your weapon to bear. The fight is over before it begins. That was the reality Japanese aces began to confront in the summer of 1944. They would push their aircraft to their absolute limits, climbing, engines screaming, vision tunneling from oxygen deprivation, and by the time they reached the bomber's altitude, they were flying machines that barely responded. Meanwhile, the B-29s could, if threatened, push throttles forward and accelerate away, or climb higher still, always just out of reach. It was like chasing a mountain. And then there was the defensive firepower. Previous American bombers had manned gun positions. A gunner sat behind his weapon, tracked targets manually, compensated for wind and speed through instinct and experience. The B-29 had something revolutionary, a centralized fire control system designed by General Electric, remote-controlled turrets, computing gun sights that automatically adjusted for range, deflection, altitude, even temperature. 4 turrets, each with twin 50-caliber machine guns, plus 2 more 50s and a 20mm cannon in the tail. A total of 10 50-caliber guns and 1 cannon, all capable of firing in coordinated fields that left almost no blind spots. The system worked like this: 5 gunners stationed throughout the aircraft, each with their own sighting station. But the turrets themselves were remotely located on the fuselage, controlled electrically. One gunner could operate multiple turrets simultaneously. If a turret had a good angle on an attacking fighter, any gunner with line of sight could take control of it. The targeting computers did the rest, calculating the precise lead needed to put bullets where the target would be, not where it was. Japanese pilots reported that attacking a B-29 formation felt like being tracked by something inhuman. The turrets swiveled with mechanical precision. Tracer fire reached out from angles that should have been blind spots. Fighters that tried traditional beam attacks, slashing in from the side, found themselves bracketed by fire from 3 different turrets, all coordinated, all computed. Head-on attacks were suicidal. The B-29's nose and upper forward turrets could pour fire straight ahead, and the speed of closure meant a pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to line up a shot, fire, and break away before collision. 2 seconds with half a dozen 50-caliber barrels tracking you with computer assistance. The math was brutal. In the early engagements over China and Southeast Asia, B-29 gunners began racking up kill claims. 10 Japanese fighters here, 5 there, and the losses were almost always one-sided. The Japanese would throw up 20-30 fighters against a formation of B-29s. They'd press home attacks with suicidal bravery, and they'd lose a quarter of their force while downing 1, maybe 2 bombers. Those weren't acceptable combat ratios. Those were attrition rates that destroyed experienced fighter units in months. Word spread quickly through the Japanese air groups. The new American bomber was different. It wasn't like the B-17s, where a determined fighter pilot with good position could rake the fuselage and knock out engines. The B-29 absorbed punishment that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. Its enormous size meant redundancy, multiple fuel tanks, robust structure, engines that could lose cylinders and keep running. Pilots reported emptying entire ammunition loads into a B-29, watching their cannon shells punch holes through the wings and fuselage, seeing smoke trail from an engine, and then watching the bomber hold formation and continue toward its target. Some limped home on 2 engines, others landed with hundreds of bullet holes, but they were damnably hard to kill. One Japanese ace, interviewed after the war, described the experience with bitter clarity. "We were fighting a machine that refused to acknowledge our faces, at efforts. It was like shooting at a dragon that felt no pain." That was the first psychological crack. The realization that skill and courage might not be enough. That the aircraft itself, the mere existence of this technological marvel, had changed the equation of aerial combat in ways Japanese pilots were unprepared for. But the true terror hadn't yet begun, because in June 1944, the B-29s were still operating from China, flying at the extreme edge of their range, conducting relatively small raids. The logistics were nightmarish. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to be flown over the Himalayas, over the hump, as pilots called it, the most dangerous supply route in the world. The B-29s in China could strike Japan, but only occasionally, and only with limited numbers. The first raid on Japan itself, the night of June 15th to 16th, 1944, sent a message, but the execution was flawed. Of the 75 B-29s that took off from China, only 47 actually bombed near the primary target at Yawata. The damage was minimal. 1 bomb hit the steelworks directly. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was heavy but inaccurate, and the fighter response, while brave, was largely ineffective. The 4th Air Regiment, equipped with Kawasaki Ki 45 heavy fighters, managed to shoot down 1 B-29 that night. 1 kill out of dozens of interception attempts. The searchlights couldn't track the bombers effectively at altitude. The anti-aircraft shells burst thousands of feet too low, and the fighters struggled just to make contact with the formations. Several Japanese pilots returned to base shaken, not by enemy fire, but by the sheer difficulty of the intercept itself. Climbing for 30 minutes, engines straining, only to watch the bombers slip past in the darkness, untouchable. For the American crews, that first raid was a learning experience. Mechanical problems forced several aircraft to abort. Navigation was difficult. Bombing accuracy was poor, but they proved the concept. They'd struck the Japanese homeland with heavy bombers staged from China, and most importantly, they'd come back. For the Japanese, the raid was a shock. Not because of the damage, which was negligible, but because of what it represented. For the first time since the Doolittle raid 2 years earlier, American bombers had struck Japanese soil, and unlike the Doolittle raid, a one-time propaganda mission with B-25s launched from an aircraft carrier, this was the beginning of a sustainable campaign. The B-29s could come back, would come back, and Japan's defenses had proven largely unable to stop them. The Japanese High Command responded by reinforcing home island fighter units. Veteran pilots were pulled from China and the Pacific. New fighter groups were formed. Training was accelerated. But the fundamental problem remained. The fighters couldn't effectively engage an enemy operating at 30,000 feet. The solution they arrived at was as desperate as it was telling. If fighters couldn't shoot down the B-29s reliably, perhaps they could ram them. The practice was called tayatari, body crash attacks. It wasn't officially categorized as suicide, not yet. The idea was that a pilot could aim his fighter at a bomber's wing or tail, strike it hard enough to cause critical damage, then bail out or try to recover his aircraft. In practice, survival rates were abysmal. Colliding with a 60-ton bomber at 300 miles per hour rarely left the fighter pilot alive, much less his aircraft recoverable. But for Japanese commanders watching their conventional interception tactics fail again and again, ramming started to look like a viable option. Some pilots volunteered, others were subtly pressured. The rationale was grimly logical. If a fighter was going to expend all its ammunition on a B-29 and fail to bring it down anyway, why not guarantee the kill with a ramming attack? Better one aircraft and one pilot lost with certainty of a kill than 20 fighters and 20 pilots lost for no kills at all. The psychology behind this thinking reveals how deeply the B-29 had already disrupted Japanese air defense doctrine. Within weeks of the first raids, they'd gone from confidence to desperation, from expecting to dominate the skies to considering suicide tactics as standard procedure. And this was just the beginning. The B-29s staging from China were a limited threat, capable of only sporadic raids due to logistics. But in the summer and fall of 1944, the American island-hopping campaign in the Pacific was advancing with frightening speed. Saipan fell, Tinian, Guam, the Mariana Islands, and suddenly the calculus changed completely. From the Marianas, the B-29s could reach any target in Japan. No Himalayan supply routes, no dependence on Chinese bases, just 1,500 miles of ocean between American air bases and Tokyo. The logistics were manageable, the supply chain was secure, and the number of available bombers was about to increase dramatically. For the Japanese aces, who'd already faced the Superfortress over China and Thailand, the news was devastating. What they'd experienced so far, the handful of high-altitude raids that they could barely reach, was about to become a daily reality. The first B-29 from the Marianas struck Tokyo on November 24, 1944, 111 aircraft. Daylight precision bombing against the Musashino aircraft factory. Japanese fighters swarmed the formation. The newest types were deployed. The Ki-84 Hayate, frank to American pilots, one of the few Japanese fighters with the engine power and climb rate to actually reach B-29 altitude. The Kawanishi N-1K Shiden, the George, a naval fighter with heavy armament and good high-altitude performance, even some experimental. Interceptors with water methanol injection for emergency power. They threw everything they had at the American formation, and they achieved minimal results. A few B-29s damaged, maybe 2 shot down. For the loss of dozens of Japanese fighters, the pattern was set. From November 1944 onward, the B-29s came in waves, 50 bombers, 100, 200. The industrial cities of Japan, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, began experiencing regular raids, and Japanese fighter pilots found themselves locked in an increasingly hopeless struggle. The best among them, the aces with years of experience, could sometimes position themselves correctly, climb early, reach altitude before the bombers arrived, set up in a good attack vector, and even then, success was rare. The newer fighters, like the Ki-84, could reach 30,000 feet, but they arrived there with engines gasping, control surfaces barely responding, and pilots struggling with oxygen deprivation, despite their masks. The Ki-84 was faster than the Zero, better armed, but it still couldn't match the B-29's performance at extreme altitude. And the defensive fire was withering. One pilot described approaching a B-29 formation at high altitude like walking into a room full of invisible walls. You knew the fire was there. You could see the tracers reaching out. But judging distance and closure rate in the thin air, with hypoxia clouding your mind, was nearly impossible. You'd line up what you thought was a good attack run, commit, and suddenly the world would erupt in 50 caliber fire from 3 different turrets, all tracking you with computer precision. If you survived the first pass, your ammunition was largely expended. The B-29 you'd targeted might be trailing smoke, but it wouldn't fall. And now you had to dive away, engine overheating from the maximum power climb, fuel running low, and the knowledge that tomorrow, or the next day, you may have to do it all over again. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese fighter pilots had started the war as an elite force, the best-trained naval aviators in the world, many argued. They dominated the skies in 1941 and early 42, but by late 1944, that dominance was a distant memory. Losses had mounted. Training programs had been shortened to rush new pilots into combat. Fuel shortages meant less flight time for those new pilots, and the B-29 represented an enemy that could not be defeated through traditional means. Veteran aces privately admitted that the war in the air was lost. They flew their missions because duty demanded it, because to not fly would be unthinkable in the culture they served. But they knew. The mathematics of attrition were clear. For every B-29 brought down, Japan lost 5, 10, 15 fighters, and they were running out of fighters, running out of pilots, running out of fuel, and the bombers kept coming, always higher than comfortable intercept altitude, always faster than a pursuing fighter could manage at that height, always bristling with computer-directed firepower that turned attack runs into deadly gambles. The realization settled over the Japanese fighter groups like a shroud. They weren't defending Japan's skies anymore. They were witnessing the systematic destruction of their nation from an enemy they couldn't touch. The B-29 had done something no other weapon system in the war had accomplished. It had broken the spirit of Japanese fighter pilots while they were still flying, still fighting, still brave. But now they were brave men flying obsolete aircraft against a technological terror they simply couldn't match. And every time they looked up and saw those silver wings glinting at impossible altitude, they knew the truth. The war was already over. They just hadn't stopped fighting yet. By early 1945, the nature of the B-29 campaign over Japan had shifted dramatically. The high-altitude precision bombing that the aircraft was designed for, the missions that flew at 30,000 feet targeting specific factories and industrial complexes, had proven less effective than hoped. The jet stream winds at altitude were so powerful, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, that bombing computers couldn't compensate. Visual targeting was nearly impossible through cloud cover. Bombs scattered across wide areas, hitting residential neighborhoods as often as factories. And so, in March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay made a decision that would prove catastrophic for Japan and terrifying for its defenders. The B-29s would abandon high-altitude operations. They would strip out most of their defensive armament to carry more bombs. And they would attack at night, from low altitude, using incendiary weapons designed to create firestorms in Japan's wooden cities. For Japanese fighter pilots, this should have been an opportunity. Finally, the Americans were giving up their altitude advantage. Finally, the B-29s would fly at altitudes where Japanese fighters could perform normally, where engines ran properly, where pilots could breathe without gasping, where interception didn't require climbing for 30 minutes to reach a target that could simply fly higher. But the reality was far more complex, and far more horrifying. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, 334 B-29s launched from the Marianas, not carrying high explosives to target factories, but thousands of tons of incendiaries designed to ignite the wooden heart of Tokyo. The target was the most densely populated area of the city. Residential districts, commercial areas, neighborhoods where small workshops and home-based manufacturing supported Japan's war industry. The B-29s came in low, 5,000 to 7,000 feet, flying individually rather than in tight formation. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese air defenses scrambled. Fighter pilots who'd spent months struggling to reach 30,000 feet suddenly found themselves vectored toward targets at altitudes where their aircraft performed well. This should have been a massacre of the bombers. Instead, it was chaos. The scale of the attack overwhelmed the defenses before they could organize. 334 bombers, spread across hours, approaching from multiple directions, each carrying thousands of pounds of incendiaries. Japanese radar was primitive. Ground controllers struggled to coordinate intercepts. Searchlights swept the night sky, but the bombers flew through the beams and disappeared before fighters could reach them, and those fighters that did find their targets faced a new horror. The incendiaries created fires, enormous fires, fires that merged into a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where the heat becomes so intense that it generates its own weather system. Winds rushing inward to feed the flames, updrafts so powerful they could flip aircraft, and temperatures that incinerated everything below. Japanese pilots found themselves flying through smoke so thick they couldn't see their instruments, through turbulence that threw their aircraft around like toys, through heat that scorched paint off their wings, and below them, Tokyo was dying. An estimated 100,000 people perished that night, the deadliest air raid in history, deadlier than either atomic bomb would be. 16 square miles of Tokyo reduced to ash. Neighborhoods that had stood for centuries vanished in hours. The fires were so intense that water boiled in canals. People suffocated as the flames consumed all oxygen. Others were incinerated where they stood, shadows burned into pavement. For the fighter pilots overhead, the psychological impact was devastating. They couldn't protect the people below. They couldn't stop the bombers. Most never even saw the B-29s through the smoke and darkness. Those who did manage to position for an attack found that the stripped-down bombers, lighter without their gun turrets, were even faster at low altitude. And the defensive fire from the tail positions was still deadly enough to claim several fighters. One ace later admitted, "We were not fighting a battle. We were watching the end of everything we'd sworn to protect." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The firebombing of Tokyo was not an isolated event. It was the template for what followed. Osaka on March 13th to 14th. Nagoya on March 16th. Kobe on March 16th to 17th. City after city, burned. The B-29s came by the hundreds, flying low at night, dropping incendiaries that created firestorms that consumed square miles at a time. Japanese fighter pilots launched mission after mission. They fought with desperate courage. They developed new tactics, night fighting techniques, attempting to position themselves between the bombers and their escape routes, using the light from the burning cities to silhouette targets. Some units experimented with aerial ramming at night, a nearly suicidal tactic made even more dangerous by darkness and turbulence. But nothing worked. The scale was too vast. For every bomber intercepted, 20 more reached their targets. For every successful attack, another Japanese fighter was lost to ground fire, to disorientation in the smoke, to structural failure from flying through superheated air. The mathematics of the campaign were brutal. By June 1945, American intelligence estimated that 40% of Japan's urban industrial areas had been destroyed. 66 cities had experienced significant firebombing. Millions of civilians were homeless. Production of everything from aircraft to ammunition to basic necessities had collapsed. And the B-29s kept coming. 200 aircraft strikes became routine. 300, 400. The Japanese fighter force was being ground to nothing, not destroyed in single dramatic battles, but worn down through unsustainable attrition. Veteran pilots were killed or injured. New pilots, with only weeks of training, were thrown into combat and died on their first missions. Fuel shortages meant fewer training flights, which meant even less capable pilots. Aircraft production couldn't replace losses, and every day, the silver giants appeared over Japanese cities, and every day, defenders launched knowing they couldn't stop what was coming. The psychological shift was complete. In 1941, Japanese naval aviators had been confident, skilled, flying superior aircraft against opponents who couldn't match their capabilities. By mid-1945, they were flying obsolete fighters with almost no fuel, minimal training, against an enemy with such overwhelming superiority that combat felt less like warfare and more like execution. The B-29 had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of inevitability. When its engines droned over a city, people knew what would follow: fire, death, destruction that could not be stopped. And the pilots who flew to intercept them knew they were not warriors anymore. They were witnesses to the end of the world they'd fought to defend. But the B-29 had one more revelation to deliver. One more demonstration of American technological and industrial supremacy that would forever cement its place as the most psychologically devastating weapon of the Pacific War. August 6, 1945. The B-29 Enola Gay, a silverplate variant specially modified to carry atomic weapons, lifted off from Tinian Island. Its crew consisted of 12 men. Its bomb bay held a single weapon, Little Boy, a uranium-based atomic bomb weighing 9,700 pounds. The flight to Hiroshima was uneventful. The aircraft climbed to 31,000 feet. At that altitude, in the pressurized cabin, the crew worked in comfort. Navigator, bombardier, pilot, all functioning normally, efficiently, in an environment that would have incapacitated them in any other bomber. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb dropped. 43 seconds later, it detonated, 1,600 feet above Hiroshima's center. The flash was visible for hundreds of miles. The fireball reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The blast wave destroyed nearly everything within a mile of ground zero. The thermal radiation ignited fires across a 2-mile radius. People were vaporized. Shadows burned into walls. Buildings collapsed. And then came the radiation sickness that would kill tens of thousands more over the following weeks and months. Total deaths, estimated at 140,000 by the end of 1945. One bomb, one aircraft, one mission, 4 Japanese fighter pilots. The news of Hiroshima was incomprehensible. They understood bombs. They understood destruction. They'd watched Tokyo burn. They'd seen entire neighborhoods consumed by firestorms. But this was different. This was a single explosion that had destroyed an entire city in an instant. No waves of bombers, no hours-long attack. One airplane, which most air defenses never even detected, carrying one bomb that rewrote the rules of warfare. 3 days later, it happened again. August 9th. The B-29 Boxcar, carrying Fat Man, a plutonium-based atomic bomb. Target, Nagasaki. Another city erased. Another 70,000 lives ended. For the fighter pilots who'd spent the last year fighting the B-29s, this was the final psychological blow. They'd known they were losing. They'd watched their cities burn. They'd felt the hopelessness of flying against an enemy they couldn't reach, couldn't hurt, couldn't stop. But they'd still flown, still fought, because that's what warriors did. But atomic weapons changed everything. There was no defending against this, no tactics, no courage, no skill. If a B-29 carrying an atomic bomb reached its target, the target ceased to exist. Every person below died. And fighter pilots, even if they successfully intercepted and shot down the bomber, would die in the blast they'd failed to prevent. The weapon made defense meaningless. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, many Japanese pilots felt something beyond defeat. They felt obsolete. They'd trained for years to master aerial combat. They'd developed skills, tactics, courage, and all of it had been rendered irrelevant by American technology. The B-29, with its pressurized cabin, its computer-directed guns, its ability to operate at altitudes and ranges that Japanese aircraft couldn't match. And now, atomic weapons that turned strategic bombing into strategic annihilation. The war ended. But for the men who'd fought against the Superfortress, the psychological scars endured for decades. Survivors spoke of nightmares, of seeing silver wings at impossible altitude, of the drone of right cyclone engines, of watching cities burn and being unable to stop it. Some became bitter, blaming their commanders for sending them into unwinnable battles. Others internalized the failure, carrying guilt for not protecting their nation despite the mathematical impossibility of their task. A few found a kind of grim acceptance. They'd fought an enemy that was simply beyond their capacity to defeat, not through any failing of courage or skill, but because the technological gap was too vast. One veteran ace, interviewed in the 1970s, reflected, "We were samurai with swords facing machine guns. The outcome was never in doubt. But we fought anyway, because not fighting was unthinkable." The B-29's impact on Japanese fighter pilots reveals something profound about the nature of warfare. Technology doesn't just kill soldiers. It breaks their spirit. It makes them question the value of everything they've trained for. When skill and courage become irrelevant in the face of overwhelming technological superiority, warriors stop being warriors and become victims. The Japanese pilots who faced the B-29 experienced this transformation in real time. They went from being among the most feared fighter pilots in the world to being helpless witnesses of their nation's destruction. And they knew it. Every time they looked up at 30,000 feet and saw those silver giants flying serenely beyond reach, they knew. The mathematics were inescapable. Japan produced approximately 64,000 aircraft during the entire war. The United States produced over 300,000. Japan trained perhaps 50,000 pilots, many with only weeks of instruction by war's end. The United States trained over 200,000, with months of comprehensive training. Japan's industrial capacity, by 1945, was shattered. Fuel shortages, material shortages, factories destroyed. The United States was producing B-29s in such numbers that losses barely mattered. One shot down, 3 more took its place. This wasn't a war between equal opponents where skill could decide the outcome. This was industrial annihilation, and the B-29, more than any other weapon, embodied that annihilation. It flew higher than Japanese fighters could effectively fight. It was defended by technology Japanese engineers couldn't match. It came in numbers Japanese production couldn't counter. And ultimately, it carried weapons that made conventional defense meaningless. For the aces who'd defined Japanese air power in the early war, the B-29 was a ghost that haunted them long after the fighting stopped, because it proved what they'd refused to believe, that spirit, courage, and skill weren't enough. Their nation had entered a war against an opponent with industrial and technological resources, beyond anything they could overcome, and that all their training, all their victories in China and Burma and across the Pacific meant nothing when the enemy could simply fly above them and burn their homeland to ash. The B-29 didn't just win a military campaign, it destroyed a warrior culture's sense of identity, and that may have been its most lasting impact. The crews who flew the B-29s saw a different war. For them, the missions were grueling but manageable, long flights, dangerous work, but they flew in pressurized comfort, they navigated with sophisticated equipment, they fought with computer-assisted weapons, and crucially, they came home. Survival rates for B-29 crews, while not perfect, were far better than for crews in unpressurized aircraft. The technology that terrorized Japanese pilots kept American airmen alive. That was the revolution Boeing's engineers had achieved back in 1940 when they proposed the insane idea of pressurizing a combat aircraft. They'd given their crews the ability to fight effectively at altitudes where human beings shouldn't be able to function. They'd turned what should have been a physical ordeal into sustainable operations, and in doing so, they'd created a weapon that psychologically dominated its opponents as much as it physically destroyed them. The B-29 flew its last combat mission in the Korean War in 1953, but its legacy extended far beyond its service life. The pressurization technology pioneered for the Superfortress became standard in every subsequent bomber, transport, and airliner. The remote-controlled turrets and computer-assisted gunnery influenced defense systems for decades. and the simple reality that technology could render even the most skilled opponents obsolete became a foundational principle of Cold War military planning. For Japanese fighter pilots, the B-29 remains a bitter memory. The aircraft that proved their courage wasn't enough. That demonstrated their nation's industrial limitations. That burned their cities and carried the weapons that ended the war. They couldn't stop fighting. Some maintained that if Japan had developed similar technology, if they'd had the resources and industrial base, the outcome would have been different, perhaps. But the reality is that Japan never had those resources, never could have developed a B-29 equivalent. The war was decided by industrial capacity and technological innovation as much as by battles. And in that contest, the B-29 was both symbol and instrument of American dominance. When you understand this, when you grasp how completely the Superfortress dominated the psychological landscape of the Pacific War's final year, you understand why Japanese pilots still speak of it with a mixture of awe and horror. It wasn't just a weapon. It was the embodiment of everything they couldn't defeat, the machine that flew where they couldn't reach, that absorbed damage they couldn't inflict, that came in numbers they couldn't match, that ultimately carried bombs they couldn't imagine. The B-29 broke Japanese air power not through a single dramatic battle, but through relentless, technological, inevitable superiority. Day after day, night after night, silver wings at 30,000 feet, or black shapes in the darkness trailing incendiaries, always coming, never stopping, until there was nothing left to defend. The fighter pilots who faced the Superfortress in 1944 and 45 experienced warfare at its most psychologically devastating. They flew, knowing they probably couldn't win. They attacked, knowing they probably wouldn't survive. They watched their homeland burn, knowing they couldn't stop it. And when the war finally ended, they carried the weight of that helplessness for the rest of their lives. The B-29 had haunted them, and in many ways, it never stopped haunting them. That is the untold story of the B-29 and Japanese fighter aces. Not a story of dramatic dogfights or heroic last stands, but a story of technological inevitability, grinding down human courage until even the bravest warriors became witnesses to their own defeat. The machine that could fly at 30,000 feet where Japanese fighters couldn't reach it. That changed everything, and ensured that Japan's aces, no matter how skilled, no matter how brave, would spend the war's final year looking up at an enemy they simply couldn't touch. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.